Okay, perfect. Well, listen, I appreciate the chance to speak with you. I wish I could be there in person, but it wasn't to be. But I'm sure you had a great morning. So, Stephan and I are going to share today, and in a way, I'll try to set up what Stephan's going to talk about. And we're interested in how balance link animals with landscapes, and we want to talk about interrelationships. And I'll begin by simply talking about how resource availability in the environment, water, nutrients, sunlight, and so forth, influence soils, but what an important influence that has then on the diversity of plant species and the chemistry of those species, and then what are some implications for us. To set the stage, though, I'd like to point out what Mark Shaxter points that he makes in the Dorito effect. And he's simply saying, for those of us who are old enough to have experienced this over the last 50 years or so, we know that the flavor of meat and produce have become blander. A lot of times it looks great, but it just doesn't have much flavor. But at the same time, the food industry's figured out how to make processed foods become virtually irresistible. And so I have to think of our kids, no wonder they don't like fruits, vegetables, and so forth. We've disincentivized real foods because they don't taste good, and we've made junk food all the more desirable. And we're paying consequences of that nowadays. It's been really well documented in the scientific literature that the nutrient density and what I'll refer to as the phytochemical richness, all these other compounds that plants produce, and I'll talk about a little bit, we know they've declined during the last 70 years, and that's a result of the varieties that we've selected for, the ways that we grow them with water and fertilizer, and then the ways that we'll often pick and ship them green. So if you, like here in Montana right now, you can go in the hills or a month or so ago, and you can find 10, 12, 15 different species of wild plants, and the flavor of those is incredible. And it's not just sweet, it's because of these rich different phytochemicals and chokecherries and blueberries and silverleaf shrubs and so forth that give a really distinct punch to the flavor of those. And we know it's not just the flavor. Those phytochemicals protect against cancer, heart disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and so forth. And so we selected against those in terms of a lot of the fruits and produce that we produce. We also grow them in conditions, and this may sound strange, but when you provide too much water and nutrients and so forth, plants will tend to accent growth at the expense of phytochemical richness. As an example, and these plants here are all cases, but if we take phenolics, they're higher in plants growing on dry sites than on wet sites, higher in plants growing on infertile sites than in fertile sites. Simply showing the relationship between the conditions plants are grown under and how much of different compounds they produce. Really important. So I'm doing this to make a point that, in the ecological literature during the last 50 years, researchers have been learning about all these so-called phytochemicals or secondary compounds. They're referred to as secondary because years ago, biochemists and physiologists didn't know what roles they were playing in plants. But we've come to understand that they play all these roles that I've put here on the screen, from sunscreen and antioxidants to allelopathy and drought resistance and defense against grazing and so forth and so on and on and on. They aren't secondary at all. They're absolutely essential to the health of plants, and we're going to argue to our health as well. So, and this is not criticizing it in any way, it's just trying to reflect. So, while some people were learning about the values of these compounds, others were reducing their concentrations, agronomists and so forth, to increase yields of crops and forages. So we were accenting growth then at the expense of this phytochemical richness. And what we didn't realize is that made plants more susceptible to environmental hardships. That's a key role these plants play as mediating relationships with the environment. In their stead, then, we've come to rely on pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers to make up the difference in what we did with reducing the concentrations of these compounds. Let me just say a word about each of those. You know, these secondary compounds once helped ancestors of today's crops cope with both herbivory from insects and larger animals and competition. This whole area of allelopathy, as it's called, that's how plants reduce competition from other plants. And in that sense, then, thinking about what plants do and how we might mimic them becomes very important. Most agricultural soils, from the standpoint of fertility, really aren't deficient in nutrients, and more is coming out on this. Rather, farming practices, tillage, fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides adversely affect the soil's gut and have compromised the soil microbiome. We've also come to rely on antibiotics and anthelmintics to treat diseases and parasites in animals. And we know now everything from insects to domestic animals to primates, they all know how to self-medicate if they're given a variety of different plants that enable them to do that. I'll let stories go for the sake of time, but amazing stories of insects and their ability and how they switch diets when they get parasitized to self-medicate. Finally, we've isolated and purified compounds to amplify their effects, but that simply made resistance all the easier for bacteria, insects, and plants. We know about antibiotic resistance. We know about pesticide-resistant insects nowadays. There's over 500 herbicide-resistant plants. So, you know, when we isolate and purify, it makes it easy, without going into the details, for these creatures to outmaneuver us. I think what's important to realize is that plants and animals have been playing these kind of coevolutionary games for ages. And the more we can think about natural systems and how they work going forward, I think this will be really valuable for us. And I think, you know, these attempts to genetically engineer back into crops plants resistance they originally had may not be the best way for us to proceed. Again, I could tell several accounts here, but I'll let it go. I just like to say one thing. In ending this, I got a note from scientists today, and I can't tell you how many notes like this I've received from livestock producers. And the essence is that farmers observe that animals, different animal species, this everything from deer, turkeys to squirrels and raccoons, pressure on their farms is much greater than on neighboring farms when they're growing non-GMO crops. The animals prefer the non-GMO to the GMO crops. And there's a story of this one. There was a squirrel that was dragging a big piece of corn across the road from this producer's place. Said the squirrel knew of the phytochemical richness of the organic grown in healthy soils compared to the chemically intensive monocrop corn just down the road. Over and over again, I heard that story. So what we've done, I think, is to move from ecological economies to fossil fuel-intensive economies. And as a result, to produce a calorie of food nowadays requires 2 calories of fossil fuel input from machinery, to plant, irrigate, harvest, fertilize, herbicides, insecticides, and on and on and on. We use another 8 to 12 calories to process, package, deliver, store, and cook modern food. Now, if you think of a wild creature out there foraging on a landscape, no species can survive spending 10 to 14 calories of energy to gain 1 calorie of energy, and we can't either longer term. I read a paper a while back that really stopped me in my tracks. It's in a journal called Ecological Economics, and he's talking about economics for the future beyond the superorganism. And he's simply, in a quite long article, making the case that our economy based on land, labor, capital has ignored the fact that it was built on incredibly inexpensive fossil fuels, and that we're now, as we know, utterly dependent on those, but their energy return on investments plummeting. So he has a lot of food for thought in that article about how to proceed. From our standpoint, what would seem like a catastrophe really will create opportunities for us to grow and produce foods. I think in nature's model, thinking about how do natural systems work, how can we work with them, And how can we create local communities that are at the heart of these? Much like when I was growing up 70 years ago, but things were much more local. And in that sense, we move away from ecological or egological to much more ecological approaches. Scaling up then and moving toward what Stephan is going to talk about, resource availability in the environment, we know influences the diversity of different plant species, and it has a profound influence on their chemistries, as I was saying. But it also is influencing the health of herbivores. I think, to me, what I say next really is kind of a summary of it all. I think often that plants turn dirt into soil, and the first mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for creatures below and above ground. That just so many. That's just the way natural systems work. I think for livestock, nothing's more important for health through nutrition than landscapes with a variety of different plant species. It's a shot from up in Montana here where we're living now. So when it comes to health then, there are two ways that an animal can self-medicate. One is therapeutically, so I'm sick and I need to get well. And then prophylactically, or that is to say preventatively. So let me say a word about each of those briefly. And, point out, yeah, I see you're still awake, that's good. Point out that creatures everywhere, anything, as I said, from insects to all kinds of creatures can self-medicate when they're sick. And I'm going to make a long story short here and simply saying that, people thought that domestic animals had lost that ability as a result of 10,000 years of domestication. But in study after study after study that we conducted, beginning back in the day, the first studies we did 30 years ago were with animals on feedlot diets, on high grain rations. And we are asking, we know that they're probably sick, and we showed that they were in fact sick, that they nauseate. Those diets, high grain diets, will nauseate animals. It's like something far too rich for us, so we were showing that. But we were also showing that if they're given access to sodium bicarb or bentonite, which, we know one result of high grain ration is to decrease the pH in the rumen. It makes the animals very acidic gut, whereas their gut normally is around neutral. It makes them very acidic. Well, bentonite and sodium bicarb get rid of acidosis in animals, and they'll self-medicate on that. And on and on, I'm going to let some of these others go for the sake of the time. But tannins for bloat, animals will do that. Dicalcium phosphate for oxalates. I will say one other thing. We know that animals can self-medicate on tannins and terpenes and alkaloids for internal parasites. What's interesting, though, is if we worm animals, studies that show where you worm animals, then they'll change their diet selection. They won't use some of the foods that they would use to self-medicate when we give them Ivermectin and so forth. So a lot to consider related to self-medication. The other part goes back to what Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure. It's better to prevent than to try to deal with it. And here's where I'll say, in all the studies that we were doing many, many years ago, looking at the botanical and chemical characteristics of the diets of animals, we see that whether it's goats or sheep or cattle, 3 to 5 plants would typically make up the bulk of their diet. But if they were on really diverse landscapes, they would eat another 25, 50, 75 plants during the day. We used to discount that, thinking that it's the 3 to 5 that are really putting on the growth and reproduction and so forth of the animals. But I don't think that anymore. And there's a lot of good studies that are supporting what I'm going to say next. Having access to that other 25, 50, 75, maybe even 3 to 5 in some of the studies that are coming out, allows animals to maintain their health in ways they can't if they're on a monoculture of only one plant. Through the many properties that these different compounds that they're ingesting have, antimicrobial, antiparasitic, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and immune boosting, these phytochemicals boost their health and protect animals against diseases and pathogens. So it's really important to understand that this diversity matters. And it matters, and very quickly here too, not just for livestock, for many, many, many creatures. And here I'm using the bee as an example. When they're put on monoculture almond orchards out in California, their health is not nearly so well as when they're on more diverse kind of diets. We know with livestock, and there are some really nice studies coming out, I'm happy to share those with you, that health improves in livestock raised diverse mixtures of plants compared with monocultures. Thinking of some research that's coming out of Utah State here in the US and out of New Zealand. We know they can gain weight more efficiently with less emissions of greenhouse gases, and they can reach slaughter weight as quickly as animals in feedlots. If I had a little more time, I'd talk about some of the specifics that are in this graphic here, but for the sake of time, I'll let that go. That's a reason, I think, that livestock producers that I know and visit with are finding the morbidity and mortality decrease when stock or cattle forage on diverse mixtures of plants rather than on monocultures. I think of a tale that producer told me years ago. He said that he's talking about why cattle perform so well on what most people would consider the mix of plants from health. He had Sericea and tall fescue. He said, I put $4 through college on that mix. And he said, your talk just helped me to understand why that was possible. And what I was saying was that tannins in Sericea bind up alkaloids in tall fescue. And so both plants become better food for the animals because animals aren't ingesting too much, over-ingesting tannins or alkaloids. We know from work that we were doing, and I was talking about in the days, that animals can learn to use appetizers. For instance, an appetizer of trefoil, or Sericea in that case, helps animals to eat a lot more fescue. And we have several other examples from range science systems that I could go into, but I'll skip for the sake of time. Ranchers like Glenn Elzinga up here in Idaho are really understanding and starting to utilize that. I'm not saying everybody should do what Glenn does, but he's really, he and the people that work for him are shepherds, and they move cattle around the landscapes, these big allotments, Forest Service allotments, in sequences that enable those animals to use appetizers, to set up boosters and main courses and so forth, and getting incredible performance and incredible meat that's coming from his place. What he's doing is mimicking what these shepherds in France do, and using these circuits to stimulate appetite and intake, to get use of all the plants in the landscape, not just the first rate or the very appreciable, but to learn him through these sequences how to enhance intake of all the plants in the landscape. And again, I'm not saying everyone should be a shepherd, but if you move animals from paddock to paddock, starting to think like a shepherd, they don't think of one species, they think, what's the mix in these different plant communities that they're going to forage over during the course of the day, and then move them accordingly. That also enables individuals to regulate their intake of primary and secondary compounds. And I want to emphasize that just a second. We did study after study where we take the most uniform groups of animals we could put together, and we would show, and I had a little more data, I took it out, thank goodness, but we would just show how no two individuals are selecting the same combination of plants, even if you offer them something as simple as alfalfa pellets and rolled barley. They vary so much from individual to individual. And so allowing animals choice and ability to choose, that is moving away from monoculture or total mixed ration and feedlot, it enhances intake and performance of animals. And we showed in a study we did with cattle, where we were feeding a total mixed ration versus free choice, that the animals offered a choice, ate less food, they were better, each individual was better able to meet its need, they gained weight at the same rate, but choice cost far less to feed than mixed did because they were eating less food. So there's a lot to think about in terms of choice and ability to choose. And that creates issues in feedlots. Actually, there is no individual animal Imagine if you had to eat the same food day after day after day. It would be stressful for you. And many studies now are showing that's the case for animals. They don't like to do that. Grain causes aversions, as I was talking about. Stephan's going to talk about metabolic syndrome, and we know about antibiotic resistance and so forth. So a lot to think about related to choice and ability to choose. Last point here is that plant diversity and chemistry influences the biochemical richness of the diets of animals, which then, what Stephan's going to really get into, can probably have really significant implications for quality of meat, milk, cheese, and meat for us. As one big example here, a study that was done in Italy years ago, they were showing that when you give dairy cows a choice on phytochemically rich landscapes, their milk is so much more phytochemically rich, milk and cheese, than animals fed a total mixed ration. And the local Italian people far prefer the meat that's the milk that's coming from animals on these diverse pastures. From a meat standpoint, I find this fascinating. Warren Angus Ferris' diary from Life in the Rocky Mountains back in 1830 to 1835. He's talking about bison. And he said as bison became fat, as they started eating really diverse diets, he said, we grew strong and healthy and hardy. And now not one, but one of us is ready to insist no other kind of meat can compare with female bison in good condition. Here's what really I think is the clincher too. He said, they don't require any seasoning. We're going to argue with the reason they're not is they're getting the seasoning from all the phytochemically rich plants that they're eating, and that's creating great flavor. We boil, roast, or fry it as we please. Live upon it solely without bread or any kind of vegetables. And what seems most singular, they never get sick and tired of eating it. There's so much in that statement to think about, but it's relating to where Stephan's going to go in what he's going to say. So if you're a hunter or if you've grown your own meat, you know the flavors of meat influenced by the diets that animals eat. And I can tell a lot of stories, hunting stories here, but again, for sake of time. But the truth is, there's very, very little that's known about how biochemical richness of diets affects meat flavor, quality, the ability to satiate, and human health. All those things that Warren Angus Ferris was alluding to. We know from some studies in Australia, and then one study on the globe, when you look at inflammatory response, anytime we eat a meal, there's an inflammatory response in our body. The degree to which that occurs depends upon what we're eating. These studies in Australia, they were comparing kangaroos with Wagyu cattle finished in a feedlot, and they were showing that the inflammatory response was much lower. Stephan's going to talk about that. When people ate the kangaroo meat than when they were eating meat from animals in feedlots. This low-grade systemic inflammation leads to a variety of different diseases, and we can moderate inflammation through the kinds of diets that we eat. Some foods are pro-inflammatory, including red meat, especially due to saturated fat in meat. But we know phytochemically rich herbs and spices, vegetables, and fruits are anti-inflammatory. That helps to explain, in part, findings from research in Morocco, where they were showing that colon cancer, the incidence of colon cancer, there isn't any incidence. It's not associated with eating processed meat, is not associated with increased risk of cancer in Morocco, and they're arguing probably the reason is how they process their meat. They do it with olive oil, herbs, spices such as cumin, garlic, coriander, salt, and so forth. So they're using anti-inflammatory compounds to process their meat. So to conclude then, I'll just say that meat isn't meat, and dairy isn't dairy. It very much depends on how those animals are reared. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephan now to talk about the work that he's taking the lead role in this. Cheerleader helping out with proposals and papers, but we're comparing meat from feedlots with meat from animals eating phytochemically rich diets. And he's going to go into the metabolomic analyses, want to do feeding trials to look at inflammation, clinical trials for variety of other things. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with all of you, and I'll turn it over to Stephan.
No. Okay. I'll look back on it. Okay. Just check it. I also speak very loud, so I'll just speak up. Can everyone hear me in the back too? All right, perfect. So my name is Dr. Stephan van Vliet. I'm at Duke University School of Medicine. I'm trained as a human nutrition scientist, so I can't tell you how to farm, and I won't do that. What I will talk to you about is some of the human nutrition work that we've been doing on linking regenerative agriculture to the nutrient density of food and then human health. So who here is now convinced, after Betsy Stock, after Wayne, after Fred, that plant diversity is very important? I think most of us are, right? So I am going to kick in an open door in that case, but I'll present to you data why that is important for us as humans too. All right, I got it. I was pressing the up button, but apparently it pressed down. That's it.
Just giving them away.
Yes, no, that's right. So there is clearly increased consumer interest in pasture-raised meat and milk. The market has been numbing about every year retail sales of grass-fed beef. The global organic dairy market has also been increasing and is expected to continue to increase. Now there's also an interest in local foods, and particularly now as we're moving into and finding out, as Fred described, grass-fed beef is grass-fed beef, grass-fed dairy is grass-fed dairy. Regenerative livestock farming, or agroecological farming, is what I like to refer to more in harmony with nature. I think regenerative is going to be a little bit of a buzzword over the next few years. It might lose some of its value, but we'll see. In any case, systems that aim to improve soil health, plant biodiversity, climate resilience, and community health, and really what my work is focused on, with Fred and his whole team of interdisciplinary researchers, do these environmentally beneficial practices that improve soil health, improve water retention, have a trickle-down effect to us as humans. I'll present you data from a work that we're working on right now, and we call it From Farm to Table to Us, and we're really linking the production to human health. So we're taking soil samples, we're taking plant samples, we're taking meat samples, and we're taking human samples, blood, urine, and stool. And we're really looking at nutrient transfer, because oftentimes we hear that healthy soils equals healthy plants, healthy animals, and healthy humans. Now, there's certainly bits and pieces in the literature, but historically, the fields of agriculture and medicine have always worked in isolation, and we're really not connecting them as much as we need. So this is the type of work that we've been working on and trying to validate that. So just to give you a little bit of insight what it might look like and how we take it from the farm to the research lab, is that we have on-farm sample collection throughout the grazing season. We go to farms every 2 to 4 weeks to collect samples. We collect soil samples, and this is a depth 0 to 10 centimeters. Is that typically what we collect? And then what we're also doing is we're looking at biodiverse pastures, collecting soil there, but then also comparing it to monoculture cropping systems. So in this case, you can already see the difference in the cornfield, but this is only 1 mile apart. This is a score that goes into the commodity market, might end up as livestock feed, versus a biodiverse pasture. We're seeing how these practices impact the health of soils. Then we also collect plant samples. We have total mixed ration samples, a pasture sample. As you can see already the stark difference in what it looks like. Then meat samples. On the left you can see grain-fed beef. On the right is grass-fed beef. And this is actually from the farmer that Fred talked about, Van Vliet, who raises beef on mountain pastures in Idaho, which have provide access to a variety of plants. And then we use a technique called Metabolomics. And I will go into it what Metabolomics is, but it basically looks at various metabolites. Now, we end up with samples. Soil, we can start with any biological sample, really. A soil sample, a plant sample, a food sample, or a human sample. Then we process those samples in the lab, and we use what is called a mass spectrometer. Now, what that does is, you can basically just identify a wide variety of metabolites, hundreds to thousands of metabolites. And these are a type of equipment that is also used, for instance, drug testing for athletes, where you try to identify specific metabolites of interest. Now, we can use those techniques too to identify metabolites in the soil, in the plant, in the animal, and in the human. Now, what are metabolites, you may ask? Well, metabolites are just products of metabolism. So we produce energy, we produce nutrients through the plants, through the soil, and we can annotate or detect these nutrients with our machine. Look at metabolite identification, usually 500 to 1,000 or even more than that. And then we cluster these into their respective nutrient class. So it may be phenols, it may be terpenes, it could be things such as amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, as well as fatty acids. Those would all be considered metabolites. And then we overlay those metabolomes. So if we have the plant metabolome, we know the metabolites and nutrients are in the plant, then we know what's in the meat, and then we know what's in the human. And then if we overlay them, we can see what is the relationship between those. What is this nutrient transfer that is shared along this continuum. So we use what is called food metabolomics. It's basically just a fancy word of saying looking at the metabolites that are in food. Now, typically, if we were to pick up a food from the grocery store, there's a handful of nutrients that appear on that. There's maybe things such as protein, we see carbohydrates, we see fat, and then we can, for instance, see sugar, fiber, saturated fat, and then a handful of vitamins and minerals. Now, foods are much more complex than those 13 nutrients that consumers see on their panels. The USDA Food Composition Database tracks about 150 nutrients, and they form the basis of our nutritional understanding and dietary guidelines and policies. And often this is referred to as nutritional reductionism, where we focus on a handful of nutrients without regards to the complexity of food sources. For that reason, you often also hear, by focusing on the limited amount of nutrients, that there's no difference between grass-fed and grain-fed beef, or that there's no difference in certain types of grass-fed beef. Well, the food matrix contains thousands of compounds that can impact human health. Plant secondary metabolites, polyphenols, terpenes, tocopherols, and other phytonutrients. Now, in our work, we really go beyond just protein, vitamins, and fatty acids. We look at the food metabolome, the metabolites in the food, overlay it with the human metabolome, and then look at the nutrigenome, which is basically disease-related gene expression. So, if we have more of these phytochemicals, then we turn off or turn on certain genes that are maybe associated with metabolic diseases such as cancer or heart disease or other diseases. And that is really what we do. So what is a metabolite? Small molecules. We either obtain those from the breakdown of foods, drugs, chemicals, or even our own tissues. For instance, if you look at amino acids we obtain, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. We obtain this from protein-rich sources such as steak or cheese or even legumes. We also get these amino acids from muscle tissue when it's broken down. We just need to constantly replace those. Now, there are certainly unique components that those things such as carotenoids and phenolic acid we don't per se produce within our body, but we can get those from food sources. So the process called metabolism really makes the energy and materials needed for growth, not just in the soil, but also the plant, the animal, and then the human, to maintain the health of us all. Now, what we're going to look at now is the impact of livestock production systems. Does the way that we raise our animals impacting the nutrient density of our food. As Fred talked about, phytochemicals, plant-produced metabolites. Plants respond biochemically to moisture, nutrients, other plants. Herbivorous or herbivores, and they produce a wide variety of phytochemicals. These phytochemicals, when consumed by the animal and by us, are potentially anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, antioxidant effects, brain protective, etc. So a myriad of health effects. So I'm just gonna kick the door right in and say pasture grazing results in a higher meat and milk phytonutrient content. This is a comparison, and I just want to highlight that this work was already done in 1987. So not using the same sophisticated techniques that we use, but that is the golden rule of science. If you can think of it, it's a good chance that someone else has thought of it way before you have even done so, right? And we're just recovering knowledge, I would say. It's the same obviously in farming, right? Where we're figuring out now that reintegrating animals and crops might be a good idea, that we're coming back to a lot of things that we used to do, and now I'll get back to it. So this work in 1987 found that the phytochemicals would actually decrease in grain fat compared to grass fat. And what was interesting is that I talked to a co-author of the study, and their goal was actually to decrease the phytochemicals. They were studying how can we grain finish the animals to decrease those phytochemicals, because they would consider them off flavors. Now, certainly, as we know now, these phytochemicals are definitely potent flavor compounds, and actually, it's what is called in French the terroir, which is really the embracing of these flavor compounds, because these phytochemicals, they provide flavor and provide unique flavors, something we need to embrace, I think, but they also have health effects. So flavor and health are definitely related. This is work that was done later on in specifically on polyphenols on the right, grass-fed goats. When they were finished on, or this was milk, when the animals were on pasture, and especially when they were on biodiverse pasture, you see these huge differences in polyphenols in milligrams per kilogram of cheese versus when the animals, the goats, are in aphos concentrate. So biodiversity is very important. So there's some work that we found too, is that this is in beef, on terpenes. These are fancy names such as alpha-cubanine, beta-caryophyllene, and transcadena 1,6,4-dianine. I think I got it right. But in any case, these are phytochemicals that have potentially anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects. As you can see here, as I also noted there, below the structure, the antiviral, anti-cancer, especially in vitro models. We certainly need more research in humans to validate this, but at least in vitro, so in cell models, in the petri dish, in the lab, they may have anti-cancer effects. Diversified pasture. Animals were 8 major species, perennial ryegrass or orchard grass, but it was a diversified pasture. You see that there's a higher amount of these terpenes. In many cases, you cannot even detect it in animals that were finished on concentrate, so animals finished in feedlots. So that is important to note, and that's also, I think, one of the reasons why we haven't thought of these phytochemicals before as appearing in meat, because you cannot detect them always in grain-fed meat. This was work from another group, work that came out in 2019. We have not worked with goats specifically, something I hope we get into next. We've done work on beef and bison, as I'll present to you next. But they found roughly the same things, and they looked at certain phenolic compounds, like chlorogenic acid, ferulic acid, and catechin. Chlorogenic acid is a major antioxidant compound found in coffee. So those who have coffee have some chlorogenic acid. If you drink tea, you'll get catechin. It's believed to be one of the benefits of green tea. Now these also appear in milk. And I do not have the slide in here, but some of the more phytochemically rich milks were shown like a cup of milk versus the equivalent in green tea, especially the green teas on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of phytochemical richness. You get similar amounts of catechin in the milk as you get in green tea, in certain green teas. Not to say that milk is per se more phytochemically rich than green tea, but it does point out that these are compounds that could potentially become available in meaningful amounts. So it's not like we're just looking at amounts that are presumably not meaningful. They are potentially meaningful and also contribute to overall dietary intake. I certainly don't want to say that you shouldn't eat plant foods, because in many of the phytochemicals are very rich in plant foods too, but what is particularly unique is that the animals consume vegetation you and I cannot consume. I cannot go out and eat the forest. I will get horrible stomach pains, and I won't absorb any of the nutrients. But animals can consume vegetation you and I cannot consume, and a further way in which we upcycle very unique compounds that we otherwise not have access to. So that's also important to note. So these medicinal terpenes are upcycled in grass-fed meat and milk. These are things with fancy names such as alpha and beta-pinene, which is named after pine trees. Mostly studied for medicinal effects in plant essential oils, but also found in grass-fed meat. And as you can imagine, they're also rich in sagebrush, but also in pine trees, things that we do not consume, obviously. So this is another way in which we can access it. And that is really important to notice, that the herbivores obviously contain plant species otherwise not consumed by humans. Potential effects both for the livestock and for us. This is the Bison work that we recently completed. This is we compared grass-finished bison. They were consuming over 20 different plants, great biodiversity, versus bison that were finished on a concentrated mixture of hay and limited amounts of grain. If you look at the figure on the left of your screen, plant phenolic compounds. I've already highlighted some of these, such as caffeic acid and ferulic acid. Caffeic acid, named that very abundant in coffee. But that is the pathway that we're seeing. And as you can see there, I want to highlight to you in the left, you see quinate, benzoate, and then hippurate, plant phenolic compound. Then, right next to it, you see the amount of hippurate in the bison. BI grass means bison grass, BI grain means bison finished on concentrate. You can see that it is much higher in the animal that was finished on grass, so much higher amounts of phenolic compounds in the meat. Also, in benzoate metabolism, which is right before when hippurate is produced, we can also see that things such as, if you look further down the pathway, catechol sulfate, 4 times higher in grass. Also, p-cresol sulfate, again, an end product, is higher in grass-fed bison. So, what is particularly interesting is that, and here it comes back again, right? Because Fred showed the picture or the quote of Baron Amos Ferris describing this vast, flavorful richness of the bison when they were consuming a lot of biodiverse vegetation. Now, 200 years later, we probably know that he was talking about the phytochemical richness of the bison, because these phytochemicals also provide a lot of flavor. So in a way, they were marinating the meat from the inside out. But just using more new techniques, we actually sort of validated what he empirically noted. And I sometimes jokingly say that is mostly what I do. I just verify what the farmer already knows with data. Someone that needs to do it, and hopefully that will help. So we did a targeted assay specifically looking at polyphenols in bison. What we see here, it's not as dramatic as in beef, the differences. My guess would be is because the bison, even though they are finished on concentrates, they do not get as much byproduct or grain as the cattle does. So we found this was a little more subtle, but here are things such as quinic acid, which is shown in the pathway, and hydroxycinnamic acid, also higher, and sesamol, which are all polyphenols that have potentially beneficial health effects for us, which have been studied for their DNA protective effect, their neuroprotective effect, their brain health. So these are all ways by which we can increase potentially the health of the animal and then the human.
Stephan, sorry.
Yeah.
Is it that those animals are in confined feedlots, or are they
Yeah, so
high grain with access to rangeland at the same time?
yeah, so these were actually in a facility in South Dakota State University, is where these animals were finished. So they were in a feedlot, but a university feedlot. So presumably those are a little bit more, how would I say it? Maybe not as representative of a commercial feedlot. That's what we're,
Better integrated bison.
yes, that's right. That's right. Better take care of. Research bison is very expensive, so they're presumably a little bit more well nourished. And we found this here, and actually, if you look at the French literature, you see similar effects where the difference might not be as dramatic depending on the type of feedlot. And we're actually doing some work now with, we look at different feedlot beef too, because feedlot beef is feedlot beef is feedlot beef, where there's definitely better practices too. So we're gonna expect difference. And I'll highlight some of the nutrition work on that too. But what is particularly interesting is that the metabolites in the meat give clues about the health of the animal. What we found was in the bison meat is that if you look to the figure on the right, glucose was higher in the grain and in the grass-fed animals. And then we look at these pathways, and I won't bore you with all the details, but these are pathways related to glycolysis, so the way that we use sugar in our body, glucose in our body, and then also the TCA side, which are part of mitochondrial metabolism. Mitochondria are the powerhouses in our cells that produce energy. Red here is not a good thing because it's like the comparison here. So what we found is that the animals, higher glucose, impaired glycolysis in the feedlot animals. So the animals really show early signs of what I would consider early signs of like pre-diabetes. Because we do this work in humans too. We take pieces of muscle out of a human subject, and then we eventually have human meat. Now we do these analyses on humans too. And this is really an aha moment. I was looking at this data, and I'm like, scratch your head. I was like, the meat of the grain-fed animals looks more like people with early signs of metabolic syndrome that we sometimes get into our lab. Whereas the grain-fed animals, they look like, we also get athletes in our lab, people that cycle a lot or train. And they actually look more like the grass-fed beef or the grass-fed bison. So it's really interesting to know is that from studying the meat, we see that the grain-fed looks like so early signs of metabolic syndrome, pre-diabetes, and then the grass-fed animals look like the athletes that I see in my lab too. So it is something to ponder at least. Healthier animals, healthier humans, potentially. So we can look at these meat metabolites and also talk about the health of the animal. And then bring it all back. When the animal goes into a feedlot, you see that the phytochemical resistance decreases. So as long when the animal's longer on total mixed ration, we see a further decrease, about 50% reduction, or 100% reduction, say, halving, and a twofold, and then eventually a threefold decrease in these phytochemicals when the animal's on total mixed ration for 120 days. And the same is found in grain-fed lamb. So the phytochemical resistance does decrease, but that's not to say that obviously even in cow-calf or stocker operations, when you employ these agroecological principles, you start off with a higher amount of phytochemicals, and you might end up with a higher amount of phytochemicals even when the animal is on total mixed ration. I certainly think at some point there may be some benefits to feed byproducts, true byproducts, even if you leave this on pasture. One thing I want to note is that, and this may seem obvious, but it's important to note, in this figure, on the axis here, we look at the forage polyphenol content. The reason I'm not using it because I think it's kind of disappears on the screen, but forage polyphenol content is important total mixed ration, ryegrass, silage, hay, grassland pasture. And then it's the milk polyphenol content on the other axis. And this is the relationship can see here, they all cluster together. The silage, the hay, corn total mixed ration is lowest. And then all the way up here is grass and pasture. So higher forage, higher polyphenols in the forage equals higher polyphenols in your milk. And so there's a strong direct relationship there. As you can see, the grass and pasture is kind of way up there compared to the others. So there's a direct relationship. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, it is the following, is that what was already described a lot this morning, first by Betsy too, is that diversity, plant diversity seems so important, and we're finding that in our work too, is that all the meats that we have analyzed, we see consistently that doesn't matter where it is, it could be North Dakota, it could be Canada, it could be North Carolina. When the farmer has plant diversity, has biodiversity on their pasture, you end up with a phytochemically rich piece of meat, pretty much irrespective of where it's raised. Of course, there are going to be subtle differences based on the forage, but overall, the sort of simplified message is plant diversity results in the most phytochemical richness of meat and milk. Monoculture pasture reduced and lower, or sometimes even undetectable, when the animals are feedlot finished on concentrates. So there's definitely a wide spectrum here of these. And I mean, I told you earlier, I won't tell you how to farm because I don't know how to farm. What I can tell you is that some of the strategies that may work, or some of the farms that we work with, is using biodiverse pasture seeding, health crop grazing, but local adaptations here are so important. Finding a ranch that, or even extension folks that can help you on your ranch and try to implement it in a way that works for you, of course, because that is very important.
I wanted to ask, do you do the grass-fed in summer? And if you're doing both summer and winter, is there a distinct drop-off?
Yeah, there is. There is. I don't have a slide here, but it is highest at late summer, early fall.
Sure.
Phytochemicals, and you see this drop-off over the winter, and it climbs back up again.
Sure.
So there's definitely a seasonality difference. Something we probably have to accept, but there could be ways, depending on the pasture seeding, where in North Carolina, the farmers we work with have warm and cool season grasses, so they are, I think, maybe able to, mellow that out a little bit. But that is definitely something that can happen. Yeah.
Is the type of testing that you're doing with the spectrometer and all that, is that something that, as a producer, you could say, how much does it cost to test this? So that you could say in your own, from our operation compared to a feedlot, we're here,
So we
is
talked
that even
about
financially?
we talked about monitoring.
Yeah.
We spent all day. So I'm currently working with Stephan to monitor the nutrition in my meats.
Okay.
I'm a year and a half into this. In 20 years, I hope to see a significant difference. But yes, you can have your meat analyzed.
But the question was we talked about having to weigh the cost and benefit ratio of things, and obviously
I won't be doing it every year.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's pricey, but you need to have a baseline
Right.
to decide, and then you can claim to your customers, look, this is the standard, and this is me.
Right.
Right. So this is why I charge so much money.
Right.
Because you don't need so much meat because you're getting all that nutrition. Where this, you need a lot of meat for very little value.
Yeah, no, that we talked about it afterwards. We are indeed starting a project where we're not like this very much research, but we do offer some of that testing and compare it, because we're also defining the spectrum of that too. So, but I'm happy to discuss with anyone. So the conclusion of part one is that foods contain thousands of biochemicals that are potentially capable of impacting human health. These phytonutrients, plant secondary metabolites, they become concentrated in the meat and milk of animals finished on biodiverse pasture. And no, repeating myself, but biodiversity is key here. Biodiversity, that absolutely better than a monoculture for many reasons, as we've seen, as was discussed earlier, for soil health, plant health, but we see the same thing in our work too. Oftentimes, people tell me, Stephan, well, there's no difference between grass-fed and grain-fed beef. Well, that's focused on a very limited amount of nutrients, but when we look at the phytochemicals, we broaden our horizon, and these huge differences appear in the phytochemicals. It's like saying when someone eats a standard American diet or a Mediterranean diet that there's no difference. No one would think that's the case. So why do we think that's the case with animals? What you feed the animal matters a lot. Several of these phytochemicals may have anti-inflammatory, antioxidant effects, overall health promoting, but it is important that we must validate this in human nutrition research. We have multiple trials ongoing, but these are not that the participants consuming this for multiple years, but running 30, 40 participants through in a fully controlled dietary feeding trial takes 3-4 years. So we'll have more data on that in the years coming. I do want to look at the human nutrition data a little bit. Some of that has been published. As Fred alluded to, chronic inflammation plays a central role in many disease processes, which are things such as interleukin-6, C-reactive protein, TNF-alpha, which you may have heard of. You can get it in blood tests too. They play a role in things such as heart disease, stroke, also in cancer, diabetes, and arthritis. So inflammation is rooted in many diseases. The metabolic effects of consuming grass-fed beef has received some study attention to modulate inflammation. This is the work that Fred was referring to. Kangaroo versus Wagyu beef. Wagyu beef, very fatty beef, finished on grain. Kangaroo, foraging on native pasture. You can already point out the sort of the drawback of the study is that we have animals to find it. We're comparing kangaroo with beef. So you can't really truly say if it's the forage or it's the animal. We're replicating the study now with grass-fed and grain-fed beef from the same genetic breed. But here you can see that we always have some inflammation after our meal, but it becomes a problem when our meals will result into having high amounts of inflammation and becomes chronically systemically elevated inflammation within our body. So then there's also been one long-term study done out of Italy, grass-fed pecorino versus placebo. The placebo here was grain-fed sheep and big cheese. Inflammation, half a pound a week of cheese for 10 weeks, the inflammation went down in the group that got the grass-fed pecorino. There has been some work done, grass-fed versus grain-fed, out of this is actually done out of Texas A&M about 10 years ago. The nuance there is that the grass-fed animals were on a monoculture pass and the grain-fed were on a high oleic acid diet, so they have a little bit, their fatty acid profile is a little more favorable than what you normally see in feedlot beef. So it's a healthier grain-fed beef and maybe not as diverse grass-fed beef, which could be the reason. I'm not 100% sure, but one of the research questions we have is diversified versus monoculture pasture. We know that the grass-fed pecorino comes from sheep raised in the mountain pastures in Sardinia. Mountain pastures are very phytochemically rich, so maybe that's the reason. And the animals, the beef came from a Bermuda pasture, more of a monoculture pasture. Also important to note is that none of these studies really tied it together. So it was a human nutrition study, but there was no real linking it back to the agricultural side of things. So it's hard to say from the study what actually the inflammatory responses may be, and we're doing some of this work right now. Research spares with there's some potential for anti-inflammatory effects. I did not show the data here, but when people consume grass-fed beef, they have more omega-3 fatty acids in their blood too, which is generally considered a favorable thing, and again, have health-promoting effects. Plant diversity appears key. Diversity produces healthier animals, more nutrient density milk, and potentially healthier humans. And really future works really focus on. That's why I'm glad we're all here today with various specialties, because we really need to start working together between farmers, agricultural scientists, human nutrition scientists, people in the social field, economics even, right? It's also, for something to be sustainable, it needs to be economically viable. So it's important that we bring together various expertise, and yeah, that is sort of what we're trying to do with this project, and I was able